This is an introduction to the case, the Banana Wars, and I think I wanted you to get a perspective on the numbers before you start to see the other aspects of the case that I'm presenting. From the data, we can see that in 1992, the size of the world market in bananas was 525 million boxes of bananas. Each box contained 42 pounds of bananas, and that Europe had 200 million as its market share. The United States share was 165 million. More importantly, you want to see who the major players are and what their shares are, and we see that 1/3 or 34% of the world market was controlled by Chiquita Brands in 1992, and over 30% of the European market was controlled by Chiquita Brands. So Chiquita is holding its own in Europe. And we go to the second company, Dole, and we see that Dole controlled 20% of the world market, 12% of the European market. The third American company, Del Monte, controlled 15% of the world market and about 7 to 8% of the European market. The other two players you see there, Fifes and Geese, are European companies at about 10% combined in the European market and about 6% of the world market. The American companies are vertically integrated, so they're producing the bananas and marketing the bananas. The European companies are mainly marketing bananas that are produced by other companies in former colonies in the African, Caribbean, and Pacific region. In 1992, Chiquita, the largest player in the market, is selling $3 billion worth, just under $3 billion worth of bananas. Dole is holding its own, $3 billion, even though it has a smaller share of the market. So you can immediately get a perspective there that if Dole is selling more value than Chiquita, and Chiquita has a larger share of the market, that Dole's product is viewed more favorably, higher price, and that is why it is earning more. It could also be that you're selling in a market that will pay a higher price, and Chiquita is willing to sell in a market that pays a lower price, and it might just be demand in the market. We are not into analyzing all of that right now, but we also notice that Chiquita is making a loss in 1992. Dole, a small profit. Del Monte is making a loss, so 1992 is not exactly a banner year for the industry. This is a case study known as the Banana Wars, and hopefully many of you are aware of the European Union. Our case takes us back to 1993, and I hope that you will pay attention to what was happening in Europe in the 1980s. What was going on is that the European Union was seeking to add more members. As the European Union has a common agricultural policy, it means that all member countries conform to the same agricultural systems and policies. And a quick story, when a country that is agriculturally focused joins the European Union, it immediately gets better prices for the products it's producing. Suffice it to say that there are non-European countries that look at the European market knowing that it's going to expand, and they say, this is a chance for us to get our products into that market. But Europe has a special arrangement with former colonies of Europe, and those colonies are generally called the ACP countries. Because the African, Caribbean, and Pacific countries that supplied bananas and other agricultural products to Europe were on many occasions being given preferential treatment, the non-ACP countries who were trying to sell to Europe viewed this as an unfair trade practice and wished that Europe would stop doing this. They wanted to get the same access. The non-ACP countries wanted the same access to the European market as the ACP countries had. But the ACP countries had a special treaty with Europe known as the Lomé Convention. Lomé is the city in the African country where they met to sign this treaty, and as a consequence, it was called, or is called, the Lomé Convention, which allows former colonies some special access to better pricing when they sell their agricultural products to Europe. In 1993, the European Union introduced a new import regime for bananas. The new regulation tried to combine four main objectives: to harmonize the import regimes of each of the member states of the European Union, to install a common organization of the market in bananas so that European producers who were not very competitive on the international market could benefit from the support mechanisms planned by the European Union's Common Agricultural Policy. I need to explain that a little more. There are some former colonies of Europe that are now a part of Europe, a part of the European Union. A good example of that would be the French Caribbean countries, known as the French Antilles. This includes Martinique, Guadeloupe, and French Guyana, or Cayenne. But there are also other non-French former colonies, which are also a part of Europe. And we can go to some of the Dutch former colonies that have become a part of the Netherlands, and therefore they are considered to be part of Europe, even though they're physically located in the Caribbean. I hope you understand that point I'm trying to make here. So when we talk about European production of products such as bananas, which are generally tropical products, it is because Europe has territory in the tropics, and those products are considered to be part of the European market. So the new regulation tried to combine that objective, to harmonize the import regimes among the member countries so that each country would import under the same rules. The second objective of the new regulation was to guarantee that access to this market was not hampered by the foreseen influx of cheap Latin American bananas, as stated in the Banana Protocol of the Lomé Convention. Bananas from Latin America, because they're sold at world market prices, are being sold for a lower price than Europe pays its former colonies, and therefore the Latin American banana producers would love to see that preferential treatment go away. They would love to be able to sell their bananas to Europe at the same price as the ACP countries are paid. The third objective of the new import regime was, to a lesser extent, to support European companies, which were often less competitive than the American companies. I should tell you the American companies, the big players were Chiquita, Dole, and Del Monte. And the European companies were Geest and Fifes. And there are a few others, but they were small in terms of their market share because the European companies were purchasing the bananas from the former colonies, whereas the American companies were owning the banana plantations in Latin America, and therefore their level of organization was different. This was the European companies' involvement was more of we'll buy the product and then resell it in Europe, whereas the American companies were more we will produce the product and try to sell it in Europe on our own, more vertically integrated. And the fourth objective of the new banana regime was to strengthen their market position with a view to greater opening of the frontiers after a 10-year transitory period. This resulted in a complicated trade mechanism introduced in July 1993, whereby 4 categories of suppliers were established, each receiving different treatment. First, European producers, mainly the French Caribbean countries and the Canary Islands, which are owned by Spain. These so-called European producers were covered by internal aspects of the common market, the European Union. They were guaranteed income support. This is a price support for up to 854,000 tons if the price fell below the cost of production. In other words, they would not be making a loss because the European community would make up the difference between what it was costing the European producers and the price that they were being paid. They would be always compensated for the difference on the first 854,000 tons of bananas that they sold. The second category of suppliers was the traditional ACP countries, and there were 12 banana suppliers in the year preceding the single market. The single market was 1992, single European market. So the 12 traditional suppliers from the African, Caribbean, and Pacific group of countries would have duty-free access into Europe up to 857,700 tons per year. Notice these two numbers are very close to each other, and the formula for determining the quantity is the recent production levels and recent sales levels into Europe. For all practical purposes, you can say that these two numbers are the same, that the former colonies were given the same access as the European producers who are physically located not in Europe, but in other places, the Canary Islands off the coast of Africa, and Martinique and Guadeloupe in the Caribbean. The third category would be non-traditional ACP countries, and they are also ACP countries, but you're saying that the traditional producers would be given duty-free access up to 857,000 tons, and thereafter, non-traditional ACP countries would be given access. So you can see this sort of as an order of preference that Europe is saying we will buy from ourselves first, then we'll buy from our traditional suppliers in the former colonies, then we'll buy from non-traditional suppliers amongst the ACP grouping, and then finally we would allocate a portion of our market to what are called third countries. Effectively, the third countries, or the so-called dollar countries, are countries where American companies are producing bananas, mainly in Latin America. So you can see the order of preference here, that the American companies would have access only after the other three groupings have had access. Together with Category 3 producers, the non-traditional ACP countries, they would share a tariff quota of 2 million tons. This is clearly bigger than what the traditional ACP countries and the European producers are supplying, but they would have that quantity that they could supply up to 2 million tons duty-free. You see here that the quantity, the 2 million ton quantity that was allocated to what are called dollar countries was going to be further divided into traditional traders, 2/3 of that 2 million, established operators of the European community and or traditional ACP banana producers, 30%, and then newcomers would get access to the last 3.5% of that allocation. The allocation of dollar quotas to the ACP companies was designed to cross-subsidize the expensive ACP bananas with some dollar banana quota rent, and thus strengthen these countries are ACP countries, but the American companies are trying to gain access to those countries so that they could get more bananas supplied. While it was initially thought to make up for the difference in production costs between ACP and dollar zones, and to enable ACP producers to remain competitive on the European market, the system soon resulted in an active trade in dollar licenses due to the insufficient level of quota allocation. This is a very important idea here. What you would be seeing going on here is that you would be selling the license to supply bananas rather than selling actual bananas. So, for example, an American company located in Colombia might decide that it wants to gain access, increase access to the European market, so it would buy the rights that the Caribbean companies had. In purchasing those quotas or those licenses, an American company, say in Latin America, could now supply more bananas to Europe, but some of the bananas would go in using this pass, so to speak, this license whereby it would be as though the bananas were coming from the Caribbean. Both inside and outside the European Union, the system has come under attack from the moment it became effective. 5 main Latin American growers, Nicaragua, Guatemala, Colombia, Venezuela, and Costa Rica, protested against the system under the rules of the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. The General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade is now called the World Trade Organization. The GATT found that the EU import regime contravened GATT rules, but the European Union did not accept the findings, and it offered to settle with the named countries, the countries we've just mentioned, in exchange for ending the dispute. All except Guatemala signed the framework agreement, which was included in the last phase of the GATT Uruguay round in April 1994. The framework agreement allocated quotas for the countries involved, which meant that national governments were entitled to distribute export licenses. The banana companies protested, seeing this as increasing the problems they already had with the system. Chiquita, the main subject in our case, decided to actively oppose the system and push hard for the Clinton administration to bring the case to the WTO, which had replaced the GATT in 1995. And in 1996, a dispute panel was established. In the final ruling, the WTO Dispute Settlement Panel found that the European Union's tariff quota regime for negotiating and allocating quotas acted in a discriminatory way. The EU confirmed its intention to comply with the dispute ruling and its recommendations. In July 1998, the EU came up with a new proposal which chose to continue a managed market for the import of bananas, but revised the system for allocating the licenses. The ways in which banana companies have been adapting to the EU regime and to the changing world market have varied. Chiquita adopted a far more formal position than the other companies. Accusations were made that the U.S. action against the EU position was brought by the Clinton administration in return for political funding from the U.S. company Chiquita. Dole and Del Monte adapted more pragmatically to the new situation. Both companies took advantage of the new system by investing in ACP and European countries to gain access to the B licenses. Chiquita claimed that the EU banana regime was illegal and an unfair trade practice. When the EU issued its amendment proposal, the company made it clear that it would not accept anything less than a complete liberalization of the European market. Chiquita traced its financial problems to the creation of the EU banana protections, but the company's market share fell from 25% to 18% in 1994. Chiquita also made mistakes when preparing for the single European market, diversifying less into ACP and European countries than its counterparts Dole and Del Monte. Finally, in 1997, the company encountered serious quality problems with a shipment from Honduras following the breakdown of its quality control operations. Let us take a look at some data to see what was going on in the 1990s. The table we're looking at shows the main banana suppliers, and we're starting with 1992, just when the European market was going to expand. Chiquita, their sales are $2.7 billion. Dole's are $3.1 billion. Del Monte, just under $1 billion. Feist, just under $1 billion. And the more interesting data are the third column here, world share, percentage of boxes. So we are saying that the world supply of bananas in 1992 is 525 million boxes of bananas, and that Chiquita was controlling 34% of the world market for bananas, Dole 20%, Del Monte 15%. So that's 70% of the banana market is controlled by these three American companies who are producing bananas in Latin America. The next column shows the number of boxes that are being consumed in Europe. Of the 525 million boxes of bananas in the world market, 200 million are being sold in Europe and the countries that form the European Union. And again, we see that Chiquita Brands has over 30% of the European market, Dole 12%, Del Monte 7%. You can see as you analyze those few data right there that Chiquita views Europe as being as important as it views its other markets. Here you can see that Dole doesn't view Europe to the same degree it views other markets, and likewise Del Monte does not view Europe the same way that it views the other markets. It's interesting to note that more bananas are being sold in the European Union than in America, so you can see why these banana producers would prefer to have access to the European market. 200 million boxes of bananas versus 165 million boxes. Let's move on to 1995 and see what's going on. You'll notice that the sales in dollars of bananas by Chiquita is going down. Sale by Dole is going up. Sale by Del Monte is going up. Sale by Feist, which has acquired geese, looks like it's going up. Chiquita is making a small profit. Del Monte is making a larger loss. Dole is making a larger profit. And the merger of Feist and geese is making a handsome profit there as well. The more salient data, again, are the world share and the European share that these companies have. You'll notice that Chiquita's share of the world market is now smaller. Instead of 34%, 3 years later, it's just over 25%. Notice that Dole is growing from 20 to 22, and Del Monte is starting to grow. It is somewhere between 15 and 16, which is close enough to where it was, but the fact that it has some gain there says that it is starting to take over. Dole and Del Monte are gaining market share, whereas Chiquita is losing market share. It's interesting that while the U.S. banana market is growing over those 3 years from 165 million to 170 million, the European market is contracting from 200 million to 180 million. It's as though the two markets are converging, and Americans are liking bananas just as much as Europeans do. But Chiquita is noticing that its share of the European market is contracting pretty quickly, whereas the other companies see their shares expanding or staying pretty much the same. Let's say they're all expanding. So Chiquita is losing some visibility in Europe, and Chiquita decides it needs to take matters into its own hands. That's when Chiquita went to President Bill Clinton and asked that something be done about what was going on in Europe. In 1997, Chiquita made the wonderful profit of zero, whereas everybody else was making money. So what we're getting out of these data here are something that's going on the world level, and what was happening is that Europe was not trying to give Chiquita increased access. What we see here is that in 1995, Chiquita and the other companies lost access to the European market, and there was some musical chairs going on there. I've tried to use traditional demand-supply analysis to show you what the market in Europe looked like and the position that Chiquita was going to take as it tried to expand operations in Europe. So in my first graph on the left-hand side, here's the demand for bananas in Europe. I call it demand 1 in the European Union. Here's the supply by European Union suppliers. It's a little exaggerated because I have what looks like a very large supply by European companies, and the difference between what is being supplied by the European companies and what is being demanded by European consumers is a smaller distance here. It doesn't really matter. The point is that there's a price that's set in the European Union, and some is being supplied by European Union producers, and more is being demanded than is being supplied, so the difference is imports. On the right-hand panel, I have Chiquita's operation for the European market, and here I show you the average and marginal costs, and I'm going to assume that the operation is a competitive operation, so I say assume break-even for Chiquita, as well as for its main competitors from Latin America, and break-even would be price equals average cost of production, or revenue equals cost. So I'm setting up what economists would call a perfectly competitive situation. So here's Chiquita producing the quantity of Q1, breaking even, at the price that Europe is setting. So that's Chiquita's starting off position. Here's the average cost by Chiquita. Here's the marginal cost of Chiquita's operations. And Chiquita is supplying Q1, which is a part of the quantity that will be imported. Okay. Now I show an increase in the demand in Europe, D2 EU, and I'm saying that this increased demand would be a consequence of the new countries that are being added to the European Union as Europe expands. Chiquita sees this extra demand occurring and decides that it wants to position itself to take advantage of this increased demand. So what Chiquita does is it invests in more plant and equipment, buying up more lands in Latin America, for example, and planting more banana trees, etc. And that shifts Chiquita's average cost operation. The plant is moving from the green average cost curve to the blue one, further to the right, so that Chiquita is going to break even at Q2. Chiquita's break even now will be at Q2, and if Chiquita tried to produce the larger quantity Q2 using its old plant, which is the green average cost curve, you'll see that the average cost would be higher than the price, so Chiquita would be making a loss. Chiquita has to have a new plant to actually achieve the break even for the expansion. So the expansion in the demand in Europe causes Chiquita to recognize that it can't just produce more, because if it produces more using the old plant, the average cost of production would increase and it would be making a loss, average cost higher than price. So Chiquita makes an investment to shift its entire plant size, and therefore we have a situation where Chiquita says the best way we can position ourselves is to expand our operations so that we can position ourselves for profitability. Now here's what happens. Here's the expected increase in demand. Chiquita figures it will build extra capacity so that it will operate right around here at Q2. In order for that to happen, though, Chiquita has to have the permission to sell the larger quantity in Europe. What Europe did was deny Chiquita the opportunity to sell the larger quantity. So with this new plant, which requires break-even at Q2, right around here, Chiquita is stuck producing at Q1, and therefore the new plant shows that Chiquita will make a loss because the average cost of production will be higher than the price, and Chiquita is incurring losses because Europe did not fulfill on its promise to give Chiquita increased access to its market when the market expanded. You could blame Chiquita for doing this because Chiquita wasn't guaranteed increased access to the European market. It was just positioning itself to outbid its competitors, so to speak. And therefore, Chiquita made this strategic decision, which backfired, and then Chiquita decided to sue because it thought that what Europe did was unfair in terms of not giving it increased access when the market was expanding. So here I say the increased demand that Chiquita expected did not materialize, and even if it did materialize, Chiquita was not granted permission to sell a larger quantity in the expanded market. Chiquita's new cost structure with its production at Q1 will yield a loss, and therefore Chiquita is suing because it said, you kind of led us to believe that there will be an expansion. We went ahead and invested in more plant and equipment, and now you're leaving us stuck at Q1, and therefore we're making a loss because you did not fulfill on the promise to expand and give us increased access.